At my brother's lavish wedding, I was surprised to be given only a paper badge that restricted my access, as if my presence mattered less. That made me feel uncomfortable and exposed. In front of everyone, a difference that should not exist among the guests. My mother, outraged by the situation, did not remain silent and promptly reacted, showing she would not accept such humiliation. Sarah Michelle Williams had always been the reliable one. At 34, she was a successful marketing executive at a Fortune 500 company in downtown Chicago, pulling in a six-figure salary that afforded her a sleek condo overlooking Lake Michigan and a lifestyle most people her age could only dream of. Yet despite her professional success, she found herself perpetually playing the role of family ATM and emotional punching bag. The pattern had been established years ago, shortly after she landed her first corporate job out of Northwestern University. Her parents, Robert and Linda Williams, along with her younger brother Marcus, had somehow collectively decided that Sarah's success was their success, and more importantly, their financial safety net. Need money for Marcus's failed restaurant venture? Call Sarah. Behind on the mortgage? Sarah would handle it. Car repair bills, medical expenses, even vacation funds, everything somehow became Sarah's responsibility, justified by her family's twisted logic that she could afford it and family helps family. What stung the most wasn't the money. She had plenty of that. It was the complete lack of appreciation, the way they treated her contributions as obligations rather than gifts, and the casual disrespect that came with their financial dependence. Sarah had become background noise in her own family, valued only for her wallet, but never truly seen as a person with feelings, needs, or boundaries. The breaking point came on a crisp October Saturday at the Riverside Country Club in Oak Brook, where Marcus was marrying his girlfriend of 2 years, Ashley Chen. Sarah had spared no expense for her brother's wedding gift, a $7,500 check that represented nearly a month of her take-home pay. She'd also paid for her parents' wedding attire, contributed to the bachelor party expenses, and even helped cover the cost of the rehearsal dinner. As always, her generosity was met with casual acceptance rather than gratitude. But when Sarah arrived at the country club, dressed in an elegant navy blue cocktail dress and carrying the expensive gift, something was immediately wrong. At the check-in table, the harried-looking coordinator handed her a badge that made her stomach drop. Guest, limited access. I'm sorry. There must be some mistake, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the confusion churning in her chest. I'm Sarah Williams, Marcus's sister. The coordinator, a frazzled woman in her 50s, barely looked up from her clipboard. Yes, that's correct. You have limited access, which means you're welcome to attend the ceremony and cocktail hour, but you won't be included in the dinner service. Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical blow. But I'm immediate family. I'm the groom's sister. I'm just following the list I was given, ma'am. Perhaps you could speak with the wedding party? The coordinator's tone suggested she'd had this conversation before and had no intention of deviating from her instructions. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she pinned the humiliating badge to her dress. Around her, other guests were receiving normal badges and chattering excitedly about their assigned tables. She watched her Aunt Patricia receive a VIP family badge, while her parents' neighbor Jim got a regular guest badge that would grant him full access to the reception dinner. The ceremony passed in a blur of forced smiles and suppressed rage. Sarah sat in the third row, behind family friends and distant relatives, watching her brother exchange vows with Ashley while she processed the calculated cruelty of her exclusion. This wasn't an oversight or a mistake. This was deliberate. Someone had looked at the guest list, seen her name, and decided that despite being immediate family, despite her generous gift, despite years of financial support, she didn't deserve a seat at the dinner table. During the cocktail hour, Sarah circulated among the guests, her badge feeling like a scarlet letter. She watched people she barely knew, Ashley's college friends, Marcus's co-workers, distant relatives, all wearing badges that would grant them access to the full celebration. Meanwhile, she was essentially being told to leave before the main event. Sarah! Her mother's voice cut through the ambient chatter. Linda Williams approached with a champagne flute in hand, her face flushed with excitement. Isn't this wonderful? Ashley looks absolutely stunning. Mom, Sarah said, keeping her voice low, there seems to be an issue with my seating. I've been given limited access, which means I won't be able to stay for dinner. Linda's expression flickered with something that might have been embarrassment, but it quickly shifted to dismissive irritation. Oh, that. Yes, well, space was limited, honey. You understand. These things are complicated to organize. Limited space? Mom, I'm his sister. I gave them a $7,500 wedding gift. There's no space for me, but there's space for Dad's golf buddies? Don't make a scene, Sarah. This is your brother's day. Linda's tone carried a warning that Sarah had heard countless times before. The tone that said she was being unreasonable, dramatic, too sensitive. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the public nature of the humiliation, or maybe it was the years of accumulated resentment finally reaching a boiling point. Sarah looked around the room at all the people who would be enjoying a meal she had partially funded. At her parents who were treating her exclusion as a minor inconvenience. At her brother who hadn't even bothered to speak to her since she'd arrived. You know what, Mom? Sarah said, her voice gaining strength with each word. You're absolutely right. This is Marcus's day, and clearly, I'm not actually wanted here. Sarah walked calmly to the gift table, where her envelope sat among dozens of others. She retrieved it without hesitation, feeling the weight of the check inside. $7,500. Money that could have gone toward her own vacation, her own savings, her own dreams. Sarah, what are you doing? Linda hissed, following her daughter toward the exit. I'm leaving, Mom, just like I was clearly supposed to do. You can't just leave. People will notice. People already noticed. They noticed when I was given a badge that basically says, I'm not important enough to eat dinner with my own family. Sarah pushed through the country club's heavy glass doors, not looking back as her mother called her name. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for several minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she processed what had just happened. For the first time in years, she had chosen herself over their expectations. For the first time in years, she had walked away instead of swallowing the disrespect. The check felt heavier in her purse as she drove home, but her shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. She had just taken her first step toward reclaiming her power, though she didn't yet realize how far that journey would take her. As Sarah pulled into her condo's parking garage, her phone buzzed with text messages from her family. She didn't read them. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine, changed into comfortable clothes, and for the first time in months, enjoyed a peaceful Saturday evening without the weight of family obligations pressing down on her shoulders. The wedding gift sat unopened on her kitchen counter. $7,500 that had just bought her something far more valuable than her family's temporary approval. It had bought her a glimpse of what self-respect felt like. The call started Sunday morning at 6:47 a.m. Sarah watched her phone buzz on the nightstand, Mom calling. She let it go to voicemail, then Dad, then Marcus, then Mom again. By noon, she had 17 missed calls and 23 unread text messages, all variations on the same theme. She needed to apologize. She had embarrassed the family. She was being selfish and dramatic. Sarah deleted the messages without reading most of them. For the first time in her adult life, she spent a Sunday without the anxiety of family obligations. She went for a long run along the lakefront, treated herself to brunch at her favorite cafe, and spent the afternoon reading in Lincoln Park. Every time her phone buzzed, she felt a small thrill of rebellion. They could wait. By Monday evening, the pressure campaign had intensified. Her Aunt Patricia had been recruited to call and express disappointment. Even her elderly grandmother had left a voicemail asking her to be the bigger person. The manipulation was so predictable, it was almost impressive in its orchestration. Finally, on Tuesday, Sarah decided to respond, but on her own terms. She texted her parents, I'll come by Thursday at 7 p.m. We can discuss what happened, but I won't tolerate being lectured or ganged up on. This is a conversation, not an intervention. Thursday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn evening that usually made Sarah nostalgic for family gatherings. The Williams family home in Oak Park looked exactly as it always did. A modest, two-story colonial with a well-maintained lawn and the same welcome mat that had been there since Sarah's high school days. But as she walked up the familiar path, she felt different. The nervous energy that usually accompanied family visits had been replaced by something steadier: resolve. Her parents were waiting in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch like they were preparing for a business meeting. Marcus was there too, still in his work clothes from his job at a local insurance agency. The job Sarah had helped him get through her professional connections after his restaurant failed. "Sarah, honey, come sit down," Linda said, patting the armchair across from them. The tone was artificially sweet, the same voice she used when she was about to ask for money. "I'm fine standing," Sarah replied, remaining near the doorway. She'd learned in corporate negotiations that controlling your physical position was often the first step to controlling the conversation. "Well," Robert cleared his throat, "I think we all know why we're here. Your behavior at the wedding was inappropriate and hurtful. Marcus and Ashley are devastated." Sarah looked at her brother, who was studiously avoiding eye contact. "Marcus, are you devastated? Or are you embarrassed that people noticed your sister wasn't important enough to be fed at your wedding?" "Look, Sarah," Marcus finally spoke up, his voice defensive, "it wasn't personal. Ashley's family is huge, and we had to make some difficult decisions about the guest list." "Stop!" Sarah held up a hand. "Just stop with the lies. I wasn't cut from the guest list. I was invited but deliberately excluded from dinner. There's a difference, and we all know it." Linda jumped in with the same dismissive tone Sarah had heard her entire life. "You're being overly sensitive, sweetie. These things happen at weddings. Space is limited." "Space is limited? But there was room for Ashley's sorority sisters? There was room for Dad's golf partners? There was room for the neighbors from 3 houses down?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but each question landed like a carefully aimed dart. "Help me understand the logic here. How exactly does someone decide that the groom's sister, who, by the way, has financially supported this family for years, doesn't deserve a seat at the dinner table?" The room fell silent. Robert shifted uncomfortably, while Linda's artificial sweetness began to crack around the edges. "We appreciate everything you've done for the family," Robert said carefully. "But—" "No," Sarah interrupted. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to say you appreciate me and then treat me like I'm disposable. Do you have any idea what it felt like to walk into that country club and be handed a badge that essentially said I wasn't worth feeding? Do you understand that I had to explain to people why I was leaving my own brother's wedding early?" Marcus finally looked up, his face flushed. "It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. We thought you'd understand. You thought I'd understand being humiliated? You thought I'd just accept being treated like a second-class family member?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's the problem right there. You all take my understanding for granted. You take my money for granted. You take me for granted." "Sarah, please," Linda said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "You're family. We love you. Can't we just move past this?" "Move past what exactly? The symptom or the disease?" Sarah pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. "Do you want to know what I've given this family over the past 3 years? $42,000. Not loaned, given. That doesn't include the job referrals, the professional connections, the emotional support, or the countless hours I've spent solving problems I didn't create." She showed them the screen with her transaction history. "Here's the down payment help for your house. Here's Marcus's restaurant loan that was never repaid. Here's Mom's medical bills. Here's Dad's car repair. Here's the wedding contribution. And this is just what I could find in 5 minutes of looking." The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Robert stared at his hands while Linda's mouth opened and closed without sound. "But the money isn't even the real issue," Sarah continued. "The issue is that you've created a dynamic where I give and give and give, and in return, I get treated like an obligation rather than a person. I get talked over at family dinners, my opinions get dismissed, my feelings get invalidated, and apparently, I get excluded from major family events despite bankrolling them." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out defensive and weak. "That's not fair." "Sarah, we don't think of you that way. Don't you? Then explain the wedding. Explain it to me in a way that doesn't sound like you thought I was too pathetic to stand up for myself. Explain it to me in a way that doesn't sound like you took my $7,500 gift and then decided I wasn't worth the cost of a dinner plate." The silence stretched until Linda tried one more approach. "Honey, I know you're hurt, but families work through these things. We just need to communicate better going forward." "No," Sarah said firmly. We need to do more than communicate better. We need to fundamentally change how this family operates. I need to see actual change, not just promises and empty apologies. Robert leaned forward. What kind of change? Sarah had been thinking about this moment for 3 days. First, the car. Marcus, you've been driving the Honda I bought and put in your name for 2 years now. I need it back. What? Sarah, that's my car now. Is it? Did you make the payments? Do you pay the insurance? Have you put a single dollar into its maintenance? Sarah's voice remained level. I need the keys by Sunday, or I'm reporting it as stolen and having it repossessed. The room erupted in protests, but Sarah continued over them. Second, all future financial help comes in the form of formal loans with signed agreements and interest rates. No more gifts, no more family helping family. We're going to treat this like the business arrangement it apparently is. Sarah, that's ridiculous, Linda sputtered. We're not strangers, aren't we? Because strangers would have at least pretended to be grateful for a $7,500 wedding gift instead of using it to fund a dinner I wasn't allowed to attend. Marcus stood up, his face red with anger. This is insane. You're being vindictive and petty. Am I? Or am I finally treating you all the way you've been treating me? Sarah moved toward the door. I'm done being your safety net while you treat me like your burden. I'm done being generous with people who mistake my kindness for weakness. Sarah, wait, Robert called out as she reached for the doorknob. Can't we work this out? We're family. Sarah turned back to look at them. Really look at them. Her parents, sitting stiffly on their couch, looked older somehow, diminished by the harsh light of accountability. Marcus stood behind them, arms crossed defensively, still refusing to take responsibility for his actions. Yes, we're family, she said quietly. But family is supposed to mean mutual respect, mutual support, and mutual love. What we have is a one-way transaction where I provide and you all consume. That's not family. That's exploitation with a genetic component. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. Behind her, she could hear urgent, whispered conversations beginning, but she didn't look back. As Sarah drove home through the familiar streets of Oak Park, she felt something shift inside her chest. The guilt that usually followed any confrontation with her family was notably absent. Instead, there was something else, something that felt suspiciously like relief. Her phone started buzzing before she'd even reached the highway. This time she didn't just ignore it. She pulled over, scrolled through her contacts, and removed herself from every family group chat, every shared calendar, every digital connection that had been used to summon her to fix their problems. For the first time in years, Sarah Williams was truly unreachable to her family. And for the first time in years, that felt exactly right. Friday morning arrived with an unusual sense of clarity. Sarah woke up without the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach, the one that typically accompanied thoughts of family obligations, missed calls, or the latest crisis requiring her immediate financial intervention. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the luxury of her own priorities. At 9 a.m. sharp, she called 8AA Towing Services. Hi, I need to have a vehicle recovered. It's a 2019 Honda Civic, license plate number. Sarah rattled off the information while sipping her coffee and looking out at Lake Michigan. The morning light danced on the water, and for once, she wasn't too stressed to appreciate its beauty. The tow truck driver called at 11:30 a.m. to confirm he'd successfully retrieved the vehicle from Marcus's apartment complex. No problems, ma'am. Keys were in it, just like you said. Where would you like it delivered? CarMax on North Clark Street, please. They're expecting it. By noon, Sarah had completed the sale and deposited $18,000 into her savings account. The Honda had been a generous gift 2 years ago when Marcus claimed he needed reliable transportation for job interviews. Funny how those interviews had dried up once he'd secured the vehicle. Her phone had been buzzing incessantly since 10 a.m. Marcus, she assumed, had discovered his missing car. She let every call go to voicemail. The weekend passed in blissful silence. Sarah treated herself to a spa day, caught up on reading, and had dinner with her friend Jessica, a fellow executive who'd been encouraging Sarah to set boundaries with her family for years. I can't believe you actually did it, Jessica said over their second bottle of wine at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse. Honestly, I've been waiting for this day for 3 years. Do you know how many times you've canceled plans because of some family emergency that mysteriously required your checkbook? Too many, Sarah admitted, realizing she couldn't actually remember the last time she'd had an uninterrupted weekend. So what's next? Are you going full no contact? Sarah considered this. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to see if they're capable of change, but I'm not holding my breath. The car thing was just the beginning. Monday morning brought a voicemail from her father that made her laugh out loud. His voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the underlying panic. Sarah, honey, we need to talk about the car situation. This is getting out of hand. Call me back. Instead of calling back, Sarah sent a text to the family group chat she'd rejoined specifically for this purpose. The car has been sold. As I mentioned Thursday, all future financial assistance will be structured as formal loans. I'm attaching a template contract for anyone who needs financial help going forward. She attached a legally binding loan agreement template she'd found online, complete with interest rates, payment schedules, and default consequences. The response was immediate and explosive. Her phone lit up with calls and texts, but Sarah was in back-to-back meetings all day and couldn't have answered even if she'd wanted to. By evening, she had 47 unread messages ranging from outraged, "This is insane, Sarah," to manipulative, "Your grandmother is so upset she can barely eat," to desperate, "Please call us." We can work this out. Tuesday brought an unexpected visitor to her office building. Linda Williams sat in the lobby at 5:30 p.m., looking smaller and older than Sarah remembered. The security guard called up to announce her. "Tell her I'll be down in 5 minutes," Sarah said, then deliberately took 10. When she finally appeared, Linda stood up quickly, her face a mixture of hope and desperation. "Sarah, sweetheart, we need to talk. This has gone far enough." "Hi, Mom. If you want to have a conversation, we can grab coffee somewhere neutral. But I won't be lectured or guilt-tripped. Are we clear?" They walked in tense silence to the Starbucks 2 blocks away. Linda ordered a venti caramel macchiato with extra whip, stress eating in liquid form, Sarah noted. She ordered black coffee. "Your father and I have been talking," Linda began once they were seated, "and we think maybe we haven't been appreciating you enough." "We want to make things right," Sarah waited. In negotiations, silence was often more powerful than words. "We're prepared to pay you back for the car," Linda continued. "It might take us some time, but we'll make it right." "How long?" "Well, that's the thing. Money's a little tight right now with the wedding expenses and your father's hours getting cut at the plant." "Mom, stop." Sarah held up a hand. "You're doing it again. You're making your financial irresponsibility my problem. Dad's hours were cut 6 months ago. You've had time to adjust your budget, but instead you spent money you didn't have on a wedding where you deliberately humiliated me." Linda's face flushed. "We didn't deliberately do anything. You're making this into something it wasn't. Then explain it to me. Explain how the groom's sister ends up with a badge that excludes her from dinner while strangers get full access. Walk me through that decision-making process." Linda looked down at her drink. "It was Ashley's family. They had specific requirements about the guest list." "Ashley's family decided I shouldn't be fed at my own brother's wedding?" "That's your story?" The silence stretched until Linda tried a different approach. "You've always been so independent, so successful. I think we assumed you didn't need the same kind of attention and that other people need." Sarah stared at her mother, processing this twisted logic. "So my success disqualifies me from basic respect? My financial stability means I don't deserve to be treated like family?" "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant. You've all decided that because I'm capable of taking care of myself, I should also take care of everyone else, but I don't deserve care in return. I'm too strong, too independent, too successful to have feelings or needs." Linda's eyes filled with tears, a manipulation tactic Sarah had seen countless times before. "We love you, Sarah. We're family. Families forgive each other." "Forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, Mom. It requires genuine remorse and changed behavior. What you're offering me is the same dynamic with prettier words wrapped around it." Sarah stood up. "Here's what's going to happen. Marcus can buy a car with his own money like every other adult. Dad can figure out how to live within his means. And you can stop treating my success like a family resource while treating me like an inconvenience." "Sarah, please. I'm done." "Mom, I'm done being the family's emotional and financial caretaker while being treated like the family's embarrassment. If you want a relationship with me, it's going to be based on mutual respect, not on what I can provide." Sarah walked out of the coffee shop, leaving Linda sitting alone with her melting macchiato. The cool October air felt refreshing against her skin, and she realized she wasn't shaking or upset. Instead, she felt calm, centered, and more like herself than she had in years. Wednesday brought a text from Marcus. "We need to talk. Can you meet me for lunch?" Sarah responded, "I can meet you Saturday at 2 p.m. at Millennium Park. 1 hour, public place, no ambushes." Saturday's meeting was brief and unproductive. Marcus arrived 20 minutes late, a power play. Sarah recognized immediately and spent the first 15 minutes of their conversation justifying the wedding situation with increasingly elaborate explanations about Ashley's family dynamics and venue limitations. "Just stop," Sarah finally said. "I don't need more lies. I need accountability." "Fine, you want accountability? Here it is. You've been acting like a martyr for years, throwing money around and then getting mad when we don't grovel with sufficient gratitude. Maybe the wedding thing was harsh, but you've been building up to some kind of breakdown for months." Sarah looked at her brother, really looked at him. At 31, Marcus still had the entitled expression of a teenager who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His hair was perfectly styled, his clothes expensive, probably purchased with money she'd provided, his attitude one of someone who'd never had to truly fend for himself. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I have been building up to something. But it's not a breakdown, it's a breakthrough." She stood up from the park bench. "I'm done subsidizing your life, Marcus. I'm done being your safety net, your emergency fund, your solution to every problem you create. From now on, you get to be an adult. Sarah, come on. We're family." "No, Marcus. Family is supposed to be reciprocal. What we have is a one-way transaction where I give and you take. That's not family. That's charity, and I'm closing the foundation." As she walked away, Marcus called after her. "You'll regret this. When you're old and alone, don't come crying to us." Sarah didn't turn around, but she smiled. The threat revealed everything she needed to know about how her family really saw her, as a resource to be managed, not a person to be loved. That evening, she drafted an email to her entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, explaining her decision to step back from her role as the family's financial support system. She was careful to be respectful, but clear about her boundaries going forward. "I love our family, but I've realized that love shouldn't come at the cost of self-respect. I'm no longer available for financial assistance, and I won't be participating in family events where I'm not genuinely welcome. This isn't about anger, it's about creating healthier relationships for everyone involved." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Within hours, her phone exploded with responses. Some family members expressed support and understanding. Others accused her of being selfish and vindictive. A few tried to mediate, suggesting family meetings and counseling. Sarah read them all, then turned off her phone. For the first time in her adult life, other people's opinions of her choices felt like someone else's problem, not hers to solve. The retaliation began the following Monday with surgical precision. Sarah's parents, Marcus, and several extended family members launched what could only be described as a coordinated silence campaign. No more daily calls asking for favors. No more texts about family drama. No more invitations to gatherings she'd been ambivalent about attending anyway. At first, Sarah wondered if this was what she'd actually wanted all along. The constant demands on her time, money, and emotional energy had disappeared overnight. She could work late without fielding calls about someone's latest crisis. She could make weekend plans without the anxiety of family obligations. Her bank account remained untouched by emergency requests for small loans that never got repaid. But as days turned into weeks, she began to understand that the silence wasn't acceptance of her boundaries. It was punishment. This was their way of teaching her a lesson, showing her what life would be like without their love and approval. It was manipulation disguised as consequences, emotional withholding designed to bring her back in line. The strategy might have worked on the old Sarah, the one who measured her worth by her family's approval and feared abandonment more than exploitation. But the new Sarah, the one who'd tasted what self-respect felt like, recognized the tactic for what it was. 3 weeks into the silent treatment, Sarah's grandmother called. Eleanor Williams was 83 years old and had been the family's emotional nucleus for as long as Sarah could remember. Her voice was frail but determined. "Sarah, dear, I think this has gone on long enough. Your parents are heartbroken and Marcus is beside himself. Don't you think it's time to be the bigger person?" Sarah felt the familiar tug of guilt, the ingrained response to prioritize everyone else's comfort over her own needs. But she also felt something newer and stronger, the knowledge that being the bigger person had been slowly killing her spirit for years. "Grandma, I love you, and I respect that you want peace in the family. But being the bigger person has always meant me giving in while everyone else gets to keep behaving badly. That's not peace, that's enabling. But families stick together, dear, through good times and bad. You're absolutely right. Families should stick together. They should also treat each other with respect, support each other's dreams, and celebrate each other's successes. When did you last hear any of them ask about my life, my goals, my happiness, not as it relates to what I can provide them, but just because they care about me as a person?" The silence on the other end of the line told Sarah everything she needed to know. "I'm not asking anyone to choose sides, Grandma. I'm just asking to be treated like I matter. And if that's too much to ask, then maybe the problem isn't my expectations." After she hung up, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and stood on her balcony, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and for the first time in weeks, she felt completely at peace with her decisions. The silent treatment continued through Thanksgiving. Sarah spent the holiday volunteering at a local shelter and then treating herself to dinner at the Drake Hotel. It was the first Thanksgiving in her adult life that didn't involve mediating family arguments, listening to passive-aggressive comments about her single status, or writing checks to cover someone's latest financial shortfall. It was also the most peaceful Thanksgiving she could remember. December brought holiday party season, and Sarah threw herself into her social life with renewed energy. Without the constant drain of family drama, she had bandwidth for friendships she'd been neglecting for years. She joined a wine tasting club, started taking salsa dancing lessons, and even went on a few dates with a colleague from her company's Seattle office. Her family's absence from her life created space for relationships based on mutual interest and respect rather than obligation and guilt. For the first time in years, people sought out her company because they enjoyed it, not because they needed something from her. 3 days before Christmas, Sarah received a text from Marcus. "Ashley's pregnant. Due in July. Thought you should know." She stared at the message for several minutes, processing the mixture of emotions it triggered. Joy for the new life coming into the world. Sadness that her relationship with her brother had deteriorated to the point where major life news was delivered via impersonal text. And underneath it all, a profound sense of relief that this wasn't her problem to solve or crisis to fund. She responded with genuine warmth. "Congratulations. I hope Ashley is feeling well. Wishing you both the best." Marcus didn't reply. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of pristine snowfall that made Chicago look like a greeting card. Sarah woke up naturally, without alarms or anxiety, and spent the morning reading by her fireplace with coffee and homemade cinnamon rolls. At noon, she drove to her friend Jessica's house for a potluck dinner with other friends who'd become chosen family over the years. As she sat around Jessica's table, laughing at stories and sharing genuine affection with people who knew and appreciated her, Sarah realized she wasn't missing anything from her biological family's Christmas gathering. She wasn't wondering what drama was unfolding, what money was being requested, or how she was being criticized in her absence. Instead, she was present in her own life, surrounded by people who valued her presence rather than her presence. That evening, as she drove home through the quiet, snow-covered streets, Sarah's phone rang. Her mother's name appeared on the screen. For a moment, she considered not answering. The silent treatment had been their choice, their power play. But curiosity won out. "Hello, Mom?" "Sarah, honey." Linda's voice was thick with tears. "We miss you so much. The house felt so empty today without you here. Can't we please work this out? It's Christmas." Sarah pulled over to the side of the road, not because she was emotional, but because she wanted to give this conversation her full attention. What exactly do you want to work out, Mom? I want my daughter back. I want our family back together. I'm still your daughter, but if you want me back in your life, it has to be on terms that respect my dignity and well-being. I can't keep being everyone's ATM while being treated like everyone's burden. We don't treat you like a burden, Mom. You excluded me from my own brother's wedding dinner after I gave him a $7,500 gift. You then spent 3 weeks giving me the silent treatment when I dared to object. If that's not treating me like a burden, what is? Linda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, more genuine. I don't know how to fix this, Sarah. I don't know what you want from us. I want you to see me as a person, not a resource. I want my contributions to be appreciated, not expected. I want to be included in family celebrations, not just family billing cycles. And I want accountability when I'm mistreated, not gaslighting about how it's my fault for being too sensitive. We can try. Trying isn't enough anymore. Mom, I need to see actual change sustained over time. I need to see that you value our relationship enough to examine your own behavior and make real adjustments. After she hung up, Sarah sat in her car for a few minutes, watching the snow fall. The conversation hadn't resolved anything, but it had clarified everything. Her family wanted her back, but only on their terms. They missed her contributions more than they missed her presence. As she drove the rest of the way home, Sarah realized she was okay with that. She'd rather be alone and respected than surrounded by people who loved what she could provide more than who she actually was. The silent treatment was supposed to teach her that she needed them more than they needed her. Instead, it had taught her the opposite, that she was perfectly capable of building a full, rich life without their approval or participation. It was the most valuable lesson they'd ever given her, though certainly not the one they'd intended. January brought a fresh start in more ways than one. Sarah had been promoted to Senior Vice President of Marketing, a position that came with a substantial raise, stock options, and the kind of professional recognition she'd been working toward for years. The irony wasn't lost on her that her biggest career breakthrough had coincided with her family breakdown, or perhaps it wasn't coincidence at all. Without the constant emotional drain of family crises, she'd had the mental bandwidth to excel at work in ways she hadn't even realized she'd been compromising. The celebration dinner with her colleagues at Alinea was everything a milestone moment should be. Champagne toasts, genuine congratulations, and the kind of professional respect that had nothing to do with what she could provide, and everything to do with what she had achieved. As she looked around the table at her co-workers, people who knew her as Sarah, the strategic thinker, Sarah, the innovative problem solver, Sarah, the natural leader, she realized she'd forgotten what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than her wallet. Her family's silence continued through the winter months, and Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm of life that felt sustainable in ways she'd never experienced. She was sleeping better, eating better, and had even started seeing a therapist, not because she was falling apart, but because she wanted to understand how she'd allowed herself to become so enmeshed in toxic family dynamics. It's called the family scapegoat role, Dr. Patricia Chen explained during one of their sessions. Often, the most capable family member becomes the designated problem solver, which gradually evolves into being the designated resource. The family becomes dependent on your support, but they also resent that dependence, which is why they often treat you poorly despite needing you. So the worse they treat me, the more they actually need me? In dysfunctional family systems, yes. Your success threatens their self-image, but your resources solve their problems. It creates a psychological bind where they simultaneously depend on you and punish you for being dependable. The insight was liberating and infuriating in equal measure. Sarah had spent years trying to earn her family's love and approval, not realizing that the very qualities that made her successful, independence, competence, financial stability, were the qualities that made them uncomfortable with her as a person. March arrived with Chicago's typical false spring, and Sarah was planning her first solo vacation in years, 2 weeks in Italy, a trip she'd been postponing for 3 years because of various family financial crises. She was browsing flights to Rome when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi, Sarah, this is Jennifer Murphy, Ashley's cousin. We met briefly at the wedding. I have some information I think you should know about what happened that day. Can we talk? Sarah stared at the message, her heart rate picking up. Part of her wanted to ignore it. She'd moved on, built a new life, found peace with the situation. But another part of her needed to know the truth, especially if that truth could provide the closure she hadn't realized she was still seeking. She responded, "Hi, Jennifer. Yes, I remember you. I'd be open to talking. When works for you?" They arranged to meet the following Saturday at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, neutral territory where Sarah felt comfortable. Jennifer arrived right on time. A petite woman in her late 20s with kind eyes and a nervous energy that suggested she'd been debating this conversation for months. "I've been going back and forth about whether to contact you," Jennifer began once they'd ordered their drinks. "But after what I witnessed at the wedding and knowing what I know now, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean, what you witnessed?" Jennifer took a deep breath. "The seating situation. What happened to you? It wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't about space limitations. It was deliberate, and it was planned." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though some part of her had always suspected as much. Planned by who? Marcus and Ashley, primarily. But your parents knew too. Jennifer's voice was quiet but steady. "I was in the bridal suite when they were finalizing the seating arrangements 2 days before the wedding. Ashley was complaining about having to invite you at all, saying you'd probably make everything about yourself because you're successful and single." Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Go on." "Marcus said something about how you'd given them this huge gift, but they didn't want you holding it over their heads during the reception. Ashley suggested just not inviting you, but your parents said that would look bad to the rest of the family." The systematic cruelty of it was breathtaking. Sarah had been right. This wasn't an oversight or a space issue. This was a calculated humiliation designed to put her in her place. "So they decided on the limited access badge?" Jennifer nodded, looking sick. "Ashley said it was the perfect solution. You'd be there for the ceremony, so they couldn't be accused of excluding you. But you wouldn't be at the reception where you might, quote, act like you owned the place because you paid for half of it." Sarah felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. "Did anyone object? Did anyone think this might be hurtful? Your mom said maybe they were being too harsh, but your dad said you were tough enough to handle it and that maybe it would teach you some humility." Jennifer's voice dropped even lower. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have said something that day, but I didn't want to cause drama at the wedding." Sarah sat back in her chair, processing the full scope of the betrayal. This wasn't just about being excluded from dinner. This was about her entire family collaborating to humiliate her as some kind of twisted lesson in humility. They'd taken her money, accepted her generosity, and then deliberately crafted an experience designed to make her feel small and unwanted. "There's more," Jennifer said hesitantly. "After you left, there was a lot of talk. Some people were confused about why you'd been excluded, and others were asking what had happened. Marcus told people you'd thrown a tantrum and stormed out because you didn't get special treatment." "A tantrum?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I quietly left after being humiliated. That's a tantrum?" Ashley was telling people you'd always been jealous of Marcus and couldn't handle not being the center of attention. They made you out to be this spoiled, entitled person who couldn't bear sharing the spotlight. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not only had they planned her humiliation, but they'd also crafted a narrative to justify it afterward. They'd turned her dignified exit into evidence of her selfishness, her hurt into proof of her character flaws. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked. Jennifer looked uncomfortable. "Because I've watched what's happened since. I know your family has been giving you the silent treatment, and I've heard them talking to other relatives about how difficult and ungrateful you've become. It's not fair, Sarah. You deserve to know the truth." As they parted ways, Jennifer gave Sarah a sympathetic smile. "For what it's worth, I think you handled the whole thing with more grace than I would have. If someone did that to me, I would have made an actual scene." Driving home, Sarah felt a strange mixture of vindication and devastation. On one hand, having her suspicions confirmed was validating. She hadn't been paranoid or overly sensitive. On the other hand, learning the full extent of her family's betrayal was like having a wound she thought was healing torn open again. But as the initial shock wore off, something else emerged: clarity. This wasn't about a wedding seating mistake that had been blown out of proportion. This was about a family dynamic where humiliating her was considered acceptable, even necessary. This was about people who saw her success as something that needed to be knocked down a peg. That evening, Sarah sat on her balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently with calls from her mother. Linda had been making periodic attempts at reconciliation over the past month, each one following the same pattern of wanting Sarah back in the family without acknowledging what had driven her away. This time Sarah answered. "Hi, Mom. Sarah." "Oh, honey, I'm so glad you answered. I was hoping we could talk about getting together soon. Maybe Sunday dinner? I could make your favorite pot roast." "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Linda's tone shifted slightly. "Of course, dear. What is it? The wedding seating situation. Was it planned? Did you all know in advance that I was going to be excluded from dinner?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Sarah wondered if the call had been dropped. "Mom, are you there?" "Sarah, Linda's voice was shaky. "I don't think this is productive. We should focus on moving forward, not relitigating the past." "That's not an answer, Mom. That's an evasion. Did you know, yes or no?" Another long pause. Things were complicated with the wedding planning. There were a lot of moving pieces. "Did you know that I was going to be given a badge that excluded me from dinner, yes or no?" "Sarah, please, yes or no, Mom. We thought it might be good for you to not be so involved. You have a tendency to take over situations." And Ashley wanted her day to be about her and Marcus. Sarah felt the last piece of her childhood die in that moment. Her mother had just confirmed that they'd all collaborated to humiliate her, and she was still trying to frame it as being for Sarah's own good. "I see," Sarah said quietly. "And you thought the appropriate way to handle this was to let me give you a $7,500 gift and then deliberately exclude me from the celebration? It wasn't supposed to hurt you. We thought you'd understand. You thought I'd understand being treated like a second-class family member? You thought I'd understand being lied to and manipulated?" "Sarah, you're being dramatic again." "No, Mom, I'm being clear. And here's what's clear to me. You all knew exactly what you were doing. You took my money, accepted my generosity, and then deliberately humiliated me because you thought I needed to be taught a lesson. You turned my brother's wedding into an opportunity to punish me for being successful. That's not. And then, when I had the audacity to be hurt by your calculated cruelty, you painted me as the problem. You made me the villain in a story where I was the victim." Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. "I'm done, Mom. I'm done with all of you. This isn't about forgiveness anymore. It's about recognizing that you're all toxic people who don't deserve access to my life. Sarah, please, we're family. No, we're not. Family doesn't conspire to humiliate each other. Family doesn't take your love and generosity and use it as a weapon against you. Family doesn't spend months giving you the silent treatment for daring to have boundaries." Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. "You know what the really sad part is? I would have done anything for you all. I spent years bending over backward to help, to support, to be there when you needed me. And you repaid that love by treating me like an inconvenience that needed to be managed. We love you, Sarah. No, you don't. You love what I can provide. There's a difference, and I'm finally smart enough to see it." Sarah hung up the phone and immediately blocked all of their numbers. She then went through her social media accounts, removing and blocking every family member who had participated in the silent treatment. By the time she was finished, she felt lighter than she had in months. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about clarity. She finally understood that she'd been trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it, at least not to her. She'd been pouring herself into a relationship that was fundamentally transactional, hoping that enough generosity would somehow transform it into something genuine. But love couldn't be purchased, even with years of financial support and emotional labor. And she was finally done trying to buy something that should have been freely given. The weeks following Sarah's final conversation with her mother brought a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The revelation of the wedding conspiracy, while painful, had provided the missing piece of her emotional puzzle. She was no longer second-guessing herself, wondering if she'd been too harsh or too sensitive. She now knew with absolute certainty that her decision to cut ties had been not just justified, but necessary. April brought an unexpected development. Marcus attempted to reach out through a mutual family friend, asking if Sarah would be willing to provide financial help for the baby's nursery. The audacity was so breathtaking that Sarah actually laughed out loud when she received the message. Even after everything that had happened, even after months of silence designed to punish her, they still saw her primarily as a resource to be tapped when needed. Sarah responded to the mutual friend with a polite but firm message. Please let Marcus know that I'm not available for financial assistance, and that all communication should go through him directly if he chooses to reach out. I'm not interested in intermediaries. Marcus never reached out directly. Spring in Chicago was particularly beautiful that year, and Sarah found herself appreciating the city in ways she never had before. Without the constant stress of family obligations, she noticed things: the way morning light hit the buildings during her walk to work, the sound of children playing in Millennium Park during her lunch breaks, the satisfaction of coming home to a space that was entirely her own. Her social life had expanded in ways that surprised her. Freed from the emotional drain of family drama, she had energy for friendships, hobbies, and even dating. She joined a book club, started taking weekend photography classes, and was seeing someone she'd met through the wine tasting group, a kind, successful man named David, who appreciated her intelligence and ambition rather than feeling threatened by them. In May, Sarah received an invitation to her cousin Rebecca's wedding, a daughter of her father's brother, someone she'd always liked but rarely saw. The invitation came with a handwritten note. I know things have been complicated with the family, but you've always been important to me, and I'd love to have you there if you're comfortable. Sarah found herself genuinely touched by the gesture. Rebecca had managed to extend an invitation that acknowledged the family drama without taking sides or pressuring Sarah to reconcile. It was the kind of mature, respectful communication that had been entirely absent from her interactions with her immediate family. She RSVP'd yes and found herself looking forward to the event. The wedding was everything Marcus and Ashley's had not been: welcoming, inclusive, and genuinely celebratory. Sarah was seated at the family table, her place card reading simply, Sarah Williams, beloved cousin. No caveats, no limitations, no hidden meanings. Just a straightforward acknowledgement of her place in the family. During the reception, several relatives approached her with variations of the same message. They missed seeing her at family events. They hoped the rift with her parents and Marcus would heal eventually. But they understood that sometimes families needed space to figure things out. No one pressured her to reconcile. No one suggested she was being too stubborn. And no one made her feel guilty for protecting her own well-being. The most meaningful conversation came from her Uncle Tom, Robert's younger brother and the father of the bride. He pulled her aside during the cocktail hour, his face serious but kind. Sarah, I don't know all the details of what happened with your folks, and I'm not asking you to share them. But I want you to know that whatever's going on, you're still family to the rest of us. Rebecca specifically insisted on inviting you because she said you were one of the few people who always treated her like her opinions mattered, even when she was just a kid. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first genuinely happy tears she'd shed in relation to family in months. Thank you, Uncle Tom. That means more than you know. Family is complicated, he continued. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. But that doesn't mean you have to accept that hurt. You get to decide what kind of relationships you want in your life. The validation was profound. Here was a family member who understood that love shouldn't come with the requirement to accept mistreatment. Here was someone who got that sometimes protecting yourself meant disappointing others. As Sarah danced at her cousin's reception, surrounded by relatives who were genuinely happy to see her, she realized she'd been wrong about one thing. She hadn't lost her entire family when she cut ties with her parents and Marcus. She'd lost the toxic part of her family, but the healthy relationships remained intact. June arrived with the kind of perfect Chicago weather that made everyone remember why they endured the brutal winters. Sarah had booked her Italy trip for early July, 2 weeks of art, food, wine, and the kind of solo travel she'd always dreamed about but never prioritized. The anticipation of the trip brought her more joy than she'd felt about anything in years. 3 days before her departure, she received an email that stopped her cold. It was from Ashley, sent to an old email address that Sarah rarely checked anymore. "Sarah, I know we haven't spoken since the wedding, and I know things ended badly. I'm reaching out because Marcus and I are having some financial difficulties with the pregnancy, and we were hoping you might consider helping us out. I know there was some misunderstanding about the wedding, but I hope we can put that behind us for the sake of the baby. The baby is your nephew-niece, and I hope that means something to you. If you could see your way to providing some assistance, we would be grateful. We're looking at about $15,000 to cover medical expenses and setting up the nursery properly. I hope to hear from you soon. Ashley." Sarah read the email twice, then started laughing. She laughed until tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from the sheer absurdity of the request. After months of silence, after the deliberate wedding humiliation, after painting her as a spoiled, dramatic person to anyone who would listen, Ashley was now reaching out with her hand extended, asking for more money than Sarah made in a month. But what really struck her was the language. Some misunderstanding about the wedding. Even now, even when asking for a substantial financial favor, Ashley couldn't bring herself to acknowledge what they had done. It was still just a misunderstanding, as if Sarah had somehow misinterpreted being deliberately excluded from her own brother's wedding reception. Sarah composed her response carefully. "Ashley, thank you for reaching out. I wish you and Marcus the best with your pregnancy and hope everything goes smoothly with the birth. However, I'm not available to provide financial assistance. As you mentioned, there was indeed a situation at the wedding that damaged our relationship beyond repair. What you call a misunderstanding was actually a deliberate and calculated decision to humiliate me, despite my significant financial contribution to your celebration. I've since learned that this exclusion was planned in advance by you, Marcus, and my parents, and that you all spent considerable time afterward portraying me as the problem for being hurt by your actions. I have no interest in subsidizing the lives of people who have such little regard for my feelings and well-being. I hope you're able to find the resources you need elsewhere. Please don't contact me again. Sarah." She hit send without hesitation, then immediately blocked Ashley's email address. That evening, Sarah poured herself a glass of wine and stood on her balcony, looking out at the lake. The email had been a final test of her resolve, and she'd passed with flying colors. 6 months ago, she might have wrestled with guilt, might have convinced herself that the baby was innocent and deserved her help, might have written a check while swallowing her hurt for the sake of family peace. Now she saw the request for exactly what it was, an attempt to exploit her good nature and love for children to overcome her very reasonable boundaries. They weren't reaching out because they missed her or wanted to repair the relationship. They were reaching out because they needed money and thought emotional manipulation about the baby would be effective. The clarity was liberating. A week later, Sarah was sitting in a cafe in Rome's Trastevere district, journaling about her first few days in Italy. The trip had been everything she'd hoped for and more. She'd spent hours in the Vatican museums, had learned to make pasta from a nonna in a tiny Roman kitchen, and had wandered through ancient ruins while processing the enormity of the changes in her life. "I used to think that cutting ties with my family meant I was giving up on love," she wrote. "But I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and even for others is to refuse to participate in destructive dynamics. Spent years enabling my family's worst behaviors by always being available to clean up their messes. In a weird way, my financial support was actually preventing them from growing up and learning to handle their own problems." She paused to sip her espresso, watching Italian families at nearby tables. The interactions she observed were warm but respectful, affectionate but boundaried. Children were included in conversations but not allowed to dominate them. Adults supported each other without losing their individual identities. "Maybe," she continued writing, "this is what healthy family relationships look like. Maybe love doesn't require self-sacrifice. Maybe the people who truly love us want us to be happy and whole, not diminished and depleted. On her last night in Rome, Sarah climbed to the top of the Spanish Steps at sunset, looking out over the eternal city as golden light bathed the ancient buildings. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the trip, but for the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she'd been trapped in a cycle of people-pleasing and financial codependency that was slowly eroding her sense of self. She'd measured her worth by how much she could provide for others, how many problems she could solve, how much dysfunction she could tolerate in the name of family loyalty. Now she was a woman who valued her own well-being enough to protect it. She was someone who understood that love without respect was just exploitation with prettier packaging. She was a person who had learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is walk away from people who don't appreciate your presence. As the sun set over Rome, Sarah raised her glass of Prosecco in a private toast. To liberation, to self-respect, to the courage to choose myself. For the first time in her life, Sarah Williams was truly free. Sarah's corner office overlooked Grant Park, a view she'd earned through a combination of strategic thinking, relentless work ethic, and the kind of focused energy that came from not having her resources constantly diverted to family crises. At 36, she was the youngest senior VP in her company's history, a distinction that filled her with quiet pride. Her assistant knocked on the doorframe. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you. Says she's your cousin Rebecca?" Rebecca appeared in the doorway with a nervous smile, holding a baby carrier. "Hi, Sarah. I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I was in the city for Luke's pediatrician appointment and thought I'd take a chance that you were free for coffee." Sarah's face lit up genuinely. One of the unexpected gifts of cutting ties with toxic family members was that it made space for deeper relationships with the healthy ones. "Rebecca, of course. Come in. Let me meet this little guy." As Rebecca settled into the chair across from Sarah's desk, the baby cooed and reached toward the window where afternoon light streamed in. He was beautiful in the way all babies are, but there was something particularly sweet about his alert eyes and the way he seemed to take in everything around him. "He's gorgeous," Sarah said, coming around the desk to get a better look. "How old now?" 4 months. "And he's already got opinions about everything." Rebecca's expression grew more serious. "Sarah, I actually wanted to talk to you about something. I've been debating whether to bring this up, but—" Sarah settled back in her chair, recognizing the tone. "What's going on?" "It's about Marcus and Ashley. And your parents." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "I know you've cut contact, and I completely respect that decision. But I thought you should know that things have been difficult for them since you stepped back." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not guilt, exactly, but the old programming that made her feel responsible for other people's problems. She breathed through it. "Difficult how?" "Financially, mainly. Marcus lost his job 3 months ago, and Ashley's been struggling with postpartum depression. They've been asking relatives for money, but nobody else has the resources you did. My dad helped with their rent once, but he can't keep doing it." Sarah nodded, processing this information without the emotional charge it would have carried a year ago. "That sounds really hard for them." Rebecca looked surprised by the calm response. You don't feel bad about not helping?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I feel sad that they're struggling. I don't wish hardship on anyone, especially with a new baby involved. But I also know that my financial support was enabling them to avoid developing the skills they need to manage their own lives. Marcus is 32 years old. It's past time for him to figure out how to support his family without calling his sister for bailouts. But the baby deserves parents who are capable of providing for him. If Marcus and Ashley can't do that with their current approach, maybe they need to try a different approach. Maybe Marcus needs to take a job he considers beneath him. Maybe Ashley needs to go back to work sooner than she'd prefer. Maybe they need to move to a cheaper apartment or ask Ashley's parents for help." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Rebecca, for years I was their get-out-of-jail-free card. Every time they made a poor financial decision, I was there to cushion the consequences. That didn't help them. It actually hurt them by preventing them from learning to make better decisions." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I never thought about it that way. Plus," Sarah continued, "they burned that bridge pretty thoroughly. It wasn't just that they took my financial support for granted. They actively humiliated me, lied about it afterward, and then gave me the silent treatment when I dared to object. Even if I wanted to help, which I don't, they made it clear that they don't see me as family worth respecting. I heard about the wedding thing, Rebecca said quietly. That was really messed up. It was. But honestly, it was also the best thing that could have happened to me. It forced me to see the relationship for what it really was instead of what I kept hoping it could become. They talked for another hour about work and relationships and the challenges of building an adult life. When Rebecca left, she gave Sarah a long hug. "I'm proud of you," she said. "It takes real strength to walk away from family when they're toxic, and you seem so much happier than you did a few years ago." After Rebecca left, Sarah returned to the quarterly reports she'd been reviewing, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation. A year ago, hearing about Marcus's job loss and Ashley's struggles would have sent her into an anxiety spiral of guilt and obligation. She would have spent hours crafting scenarios where she could help without completely compromising her boundaries. Now she felt something much simpler, compassion without compulsion. She could feel sorry for their situation without feeling responsible for fixing it. She could wish them well without sacrificing her own well-being to ensure their comfort. That evening, Sarah met David for dinner at their favorite restaurant in River North. Over the past year, their relationship had deepened into something Sarah had never experienced before. Love without conditions, support without depletion, partnership without the loss of individual identity. "You're quiet tonight," David observed as they shared a bottle of wine. "Everything okay?" Sarah told him about Rebecca's visit and the update on her family situation. David listened without trying to fix anything or offer advice. Another gift of healthy relationships she was still learning to appreciate. "How do you feel about all that?" he asked when she finished. "Peaceful," Sarah realized with some surprise. "A year ago, I would have been torn up about it. I would have convinced myself that helping them was the right thing to do, even though they'd treated me terribly. Now I can see that their problems are theirs to solve." "That's growth," David said simply. Later that night, as Sarah got ready for bed in her quiet, beautiful condo, she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who had walked out of Marcus's wedding 18 months ago. This woman had clearer eyes, straighter shoulders, and something indefinable but unmistakable: the confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Drinks tomorrow to celebrate your promotion anniversary?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. I have so much to celebrate." And she did. She had a career that fulfilled her, relationships that nourished her, and most importantly, a sense of self that no longer required external validation to sustain. She had learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between family obligation and family love, between giving and being exploited. She had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love, for yourself and others, is the courage to walk away from relationships that diminish you. She had learned that you can't change other people, but you can change how you respond to them. And she had learned that the people who truly belong in your life will respect your boundaries, not punish you for having them. As Sarah turned off the lights and settled into bed, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived authentically. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments to practice the self-respect she'd fought so hard to claim. But tonight, she was simply grateful for the journey that had brought her here, for the strength to choose herself, and for the beautiful life that had emerged when she finally stopped trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it freely. In the darkness of her bedroom, Sarah Williams smiled and drifted off to sleep, free, whole, and finally home in her own life.